Today we're going over quite possibly the greatest comeback in history. And no, I'm not talking about a sports team coming back from being 3-0 down. I'm talking about a man who lost an entire empire, was forced into exile on a tiny island, had basically every major European country hunting for him, and then decided, you know what? I'm going back. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte and the absolutely ridiculous 100 days in 1815 when he returned from exile, marched across France, reclaimed the throne, built a new army, and somehow convinced thousands of soldiers to join him. Only to eventually lose one final battle and get sent to an island so remote that even Google Maps would probably say, "Bro, you're on your own." This is Napoleon's 100 days. And it all begins after Napoleon's spectacular downfall. By 1814, Napoleon had spent more than a decade turning Europe into his personal strategy game. He had conquered huge parts of the continent, defeated Austria, Prussia, Russia, and pretty much anyone else who looked at him funny. But eventually, the coalition of European powers finally managed to defeat him. Paris fell in March 1814. Napoleon abdicated. And the victorious powers decided they had a very simple solution to the Napoleon problem. Send him somewhere far away. So they gave him the island of Elba. Now Elba is a beautiful little island in the Mediterranean. But Napoleon wasn't exactly thrilled. This was the man who had once ruled an empire stretching across much of Europe. And now his kingdom consisted of an island about 224 square kilometers in size. That's not an empire. That's basically a vacation property with administrative responsibilities. The European powers also allowed Napoleon to keep a small personal army and gave him the title of ruler of Elba. So technically, Napoleon was still an emperor. Just an emperor whose empire you could walk across before lunch. Meanwhile, France was being ruled by the Bourbon monarchy. The new king was Louis XVIII, brother of the executed King Louis XVI. The monarchy wanted France to return to the old order. But there was a problem. A very large number of French soldiers and civilians had spent years living under Napoleon. And they weren't necessarily thrilled about the new government. Napoleon had given soldiers medals, promotions, glory, and a sense that France was the greatest military power on earth. Now many veterans were being pushed aside. The army was being reorganized. The government was unpopular. And Napoleon, sitting on Elba, was paying very close attention. Because while everyone else thought Napoleon's story was over, Napoleon apparently hadn't read the ending. He had also learned something important. The European powers were arguing among themselves. At the Congress of Vienna, representatives from across Europe were trying to redraw the map after Napoleon's wars. Britain wanted balance. Austria wanted influence. Russia wanted territory. Prussia wanted territory. France wanted not to get bullied. And everyone wanted to make sure Napoleon stayed on Elba. But there was one little problem. They had underestimated Napoleon's ability to cause problems. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his move. He secretly boarded ships with around 1,000 men and sailed away from Elba. Imagine being one of his soldiers. Your boss says, "All right, boys, we're going back to France." And you're thinking, "Back to France? Yes, to do what? Take over. Take over what? France. From whom? The king. Which king? Louis. Is this legal? No. Do we have an army? Not really. Excellent. Let's go." Napoleon landed at Gulf Juan on March 1, 1815. He had returned to France, and the French government immediately panicked. Louis XVI sent troops to stop him. Napoleon's force was tiny compared with the French army. He should have been crushed. But then something extraordinary happened. The French soldiers sent to stop him began joining him. Napoleon marched north. At every stage, more soldiers defected. The government had ordered the army to arrest him. Instead, the army kept joining him. The French authorities had basically created an army to stop Napoleon, and accidentally delivered it to him. One of the most famous moments happened when Napoleon encountered troops commanded by Marshal Mitchell Ney. Ney had previously served Napoleon, but had pledged loyalty to Louis XVIII. Ney had reportedly promised to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, which sounds like something you'd say when you're extremely confident. But then Ney's soldiers confronted Napoleon. Napoleon stepped forward alone. He opened his coat and shouted something along the lines of, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, recognize your emperor. If any of you wish to kill your emperor, you may do so." And then he stood there. No guards, no giant speech, just Napoleon. The soldiers stared at him, and then they started shouting, "Vive l'Empereur," and joined him. So much for the iron cage. At this point, Napoleon's comeback was starting to look less like an invasion and more like a reunion tour. Except instead of selling concert tickets, he was taking over France. The government realized things were getting seriously bad. Louis XVIII fled Paris, and on March 20, Napoleon entered the capital. He had been exiled for less than a year, and somehow he was back in the Tuileries Palace. The reaction was incredible. Napoleon had returned with barely a fight. His political enemies were terrified. His supporters were celebrating. And Europe was collectively staring at the map saying, "Wait, didn't we already deal with this guy?" Yes, they had, but apparently they hadn't dealt with him enough. Napoleon had now reclaimed power, and this period became known as the 100 Days. Although technically it lasted around 111 days from his return to Paris until his second abdication. But Napoleon's 100-ish days doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Now Napoleon had a much bigger problem. Europe. The major powers immediately declared that Napoleon was an enemy of peace and began preparing another coalition against him. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia all started mobilizing armies. And Napoleon knew exactly what was coming. He couldn't wait for them to invade France. If the coalition armies united, France would be surrounded by enormous forces. So Napoleon came up with a plan. Attack first. His target was Belgium, where British and Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington were gathering, along with the Prussian army commanded by Gebhard von Blücher. Napoleon hoped to defeat the armies separately before they could combine. And this was classic Napoleon. Move quickly. Concentrate your forces. Destroy one enemy. Then turn around and destroy the other. Simple. Except this time there was one enormous difference. Napoleon wasn't the same man he had been 10 years earlier. He was older. His health wasn't as good. France had fewer resources. His army was less experienced. And his enemies had spent years learning how to fight him. Still, Napoleon raised an army of roughly 120,000 men and marched north. His first major objective was the Prussian army. On June 15, 1815, French forces crossed into Belgium. The campaign had begun, and Napoleon immediately started moving aggressively. The first major battle came at Quatre-Bras on June 16. French forces attempted to prevent Wellington's Allied army from concentrating. At the same time, Napoleon attacked the Prussians at Ligny. And at Ligny, Napoleon achieved his last major battlefield victory. The French army defeated Blücher's Prussians. Napoleon had done what he wanted. The Prussians were beaten, but they weren't destroyed. And this tiny distinction was about to become extremely important. Napoleon assumed the Prussians would retreat eastward. Instead, Blücher decided to move north and then west, toward Wellington. Meanwhile, Wellington gathered his army near a small ridge south of Brussels. The location was called Waterloo. And on June 18, Napoleon arrived. This was it, the final showdown. Napoleon had returned from exile. He had marched across France. He had reclaimed Paris. He had built a new army. He had defeated the Prussians at Ligny. And now he had one major battle standing between himself and survival. Across the battlefield was Wellington. The British commander had spent years fighting Napoleon in Spain and Portugal. He knew Napoleon's methods. And unlike many of Napoleon's earlier enemies, Wellington wasn't interested in charging forward just because the French looked scary. He positioned his troops defensively behind a ridge. Napoleon looked across the battlefield. The French army was ready. Wellington's army was ready. And somewhere in the distance, the defeated Prussians were also moving. Napoleon needed to defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived. That was the entire game. The battle began late in the morning. French forces launched attacks against Wellington's positions. One of the first major attacks targeted the Allied position at Hougoumont. The fighting there became incredibly intense. French troops repeatedly attacked the fortified farm complex. But the defenders held on. And while Napoleon's troops were fighting at Hougoumont, the battle was turning into a giant meat grinder. The French attacked. The Allies held. The French attacked again. The Allies held again. It was like trying to win an argument with a brick wall. Eventually, Napoleon launched a massive infantry assault against the Allied center. Thousands of French soldiers advanced up the slope. Wellington's troops waited until they were close, then opened fire. The French attack was thrown back. But Napoleon wasn't finished. He committed more forces. The fighting continued for hours. And then came one of the most important moments of the entire battle. The Prussians arrived. Remember those guys Napoleon had defeated 2 days earlier? Yeah, they were back. Blücher had kept his army together and marched toward Waterloo. The first Prussian troops began appearing on the French right flank. And Napoleon now had a massive problem. He wasn't just fighting Wellington. He was fighting Wellington and Blücher. The battle became increasingly desperate. Napoleon sent Marshal Ney forward with cavalry, and Ney launched repeated cavalry attacks against the Allied positions. Hundreds and then thousands of French cavalrymen charged uphill. The Allied infantry formed squares. Imagine being a soldier standing in a giant box formation while thousands of cavalrymen are charging toward you. The horses come closer. The ground shakes. The French cavalry crashes against the squares. And the Allied infantry fires. The cavalry pulls back, then charges again. And again, and again. But the Allied squares hold. Ney's cavalry attacks achieve little. And this is one of those moments where history feels almost absurd. Napoleon had some of the finest cavalry in Europe, and they were basically running into a human porcupine. The French situation was getting worse. The Prussians were now attacking Napoleon's flank. Wellington's army was still holding, and Napoleon's army was taking enormous casualties. But Napoleon still had one last card: the Imperial Guard. These were Napoleon's elite soldiers. Veterans, men who had fought across Europe. They had an almost legendary reputation. For years, the Imperial Guard had been Napoleon's ultimate reserve. When everything else failed, the Guard could be trusted. Now Napoleon sent them forward. The battlefield had become chaos. Smoke covered everything. The French soldiers were exhausted. The Allies were exhausted. But Napoleon's final attack was about to begin. The Imperial Guard advanced toward Wellington's position. For a moment, it looked like the French might still break through. Then Wellington gave the order. The Allied troops opened fire. The Imperial Guard faltered. And then something happened that had almost never happened before. The Imperial Guard began to retreat. Napoleon's army saw it. And suddenly the impossible happened. Panic. The French line began collapsing. Soldiers started running. Wellington's army advanced. The Prussians attacked. And the French army began turning into one giant stampede. Someone shouted, "The Guard is retreating." And suddenly everyone knew. Napoleon had lost. The phrase, "the Guard dies but never surrenders," became associated with the legend of Waterloo, although the exact wording and circumstances are disputed. But the basic reality was clear. Napoleon's final reserve had failed. The comeback was over. The man who had escaped exile, crossed France, reclaimed his throne, and challenged Europe had finally been defeated. Napoleon fled the battlefield. He eventually returned to Paris. And this time there was no miracle waiting for him. Political support collapsed. Napoleon abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815. His 100 days were over. But Napoleon still had one final problem. Where do you send a man who has already escaped from one island? The British had a solution. Don't give him a Mediterranean island this time. Give him somewhere much farther away. Napoleon surrendered to the British and was eventually sent to the island of Saint Helena in the South Atlantic. This island was thousands of miles from Europe. No convenient escape. No nearby army. No European politics. Just Napoleon, the Atlantic Ocean, and a lot of time to think about what went wrong. He would remain there until his death in 1821. And that was the end. But the reason the 100 Days remains one of the greatest comebacks in history isn't because Napoleon ultimately won. He didn't. In fact, he lost everything again. That's what makes it so ridiculous. Think about the situation. You are Napoleon Bonaparte. You've ruled France. You've conquered most of continental Europe. Then you lose. You abdicate. You're exiled to an island. The victorious powers decide your political career is finished. Your replacement becomes king. Your army is gone. Your empire is gone. Your allies are gone. So naturally, you escape. You land in France with roughly 1,000 men. You don't even have a real army. And yet within weeks, the government collapses. Thousands of soldiers join you. The king runs away. You walk into Paris, and suddenly you're emperor again. That's an absolutely insane comeback. And the craziest part is that Napoleon didn't need to conquer France. France basically opened the door and said, "Welcome back." Of course, the comeback ultimately failed. The coalition was too powerful. Waterloo destroyed Napoleon's last chance. And after his final defeat, the European powers made sure he could never return again. But for roughly 3 months in 1815, Napoleon managed something that should have been almost impossible. He went from defeated emperor in exile to ruler of France again. No enormous invasion fleet. No massive foreign army. No years-long rebellion. Just one extremely confident man stepping off a boat and saying, "All right, I'm back." And somehow, France believed him. The 100 Days therefore wasn't the greatest comeback because Napoleon won. It was the greatest comeback because he had absolutely no business making it that far. He was supposed to be finished. Instead, he returned from exile, crossed France, defeated the government without a major battle, reclaimed Paris, raised an army, marched into Belgium, and came within one battle of changing European history all over again. And then Waterloo happened, which is basically history's way of saying, okay, that's enough. Napoleon's story had finally reached its real ending. But for those 100 days, Europe learned a very important lesson. If you exile Napoleon, maybe don't leave him somewhere with a boat, because apparently that guy only needed one. History isn't dead. It's waiting to be told.